Hello, my name is Amod Singhal, and the topic today is understanding MicroStrategy level metrics. Level metrics in MicroStrategy are a topic in advanced reporting and often the subject of much confusion. What I'm hoping is that this video will help to clear up some of that confusion and help you understand level metrics a little bit better. What I will be covering in this video are the following. So here's the agenda. The first thing I will talk about is what is meant by a report level so that we can set the groundwork for understanding level metrics. And then we'll go into the motivation for level metrics using certain examples. We'll clarify exactly what value level metrics bring to us and why we need them. And then we'll dive deep into the three parameters that define level metrics: target, filtering, and grouping, and see how different combinations of those help us achieve the results that we want. What I will not cover here is the mechanics of creating level metrics, nor will I go into the details of the SQL generated when level metrics are utilized. Though I will make some minor references to the SQL, but I will not go into a lot of detail on that. Furthermore, there are two special cases of level metrics that I will not be discussing. And the first one of those is where filtering and grouping are both set to none. That special case I'll just mention is for making sure that MicroStrategy uses a specific fact table in calculation of the metric, and we will not be covering that. A second special case is removal of the report level target from the level metric specifications, and I won't be going into that either. The prerequisites for understanding level metrics are that you must have a basic understanding of MicroStrategy's attributes, metrics, filters, and reports. With that basic understanding, you will be able to understand what is meant by level metrics. The first thing we want to do is to understand what is meant by level, and in particular, what is meant by a report level. So let's take a look at a report. Examples are better for understanding than going into a lot of verbiage. So here we ran a report which lists the revenue by country and region. The level of this report basically means the breakdown at which the revenue is shown. So revenue is shown here for country and region. Now, since country and region are related and region is a lower level metric, attribute rather, region is a lower level attribute in the hierarchy. Therefore, the report level for this particular report will be considered to be region. Let's take another example. We're going to run a report very similar to the one we just ran, except here we have country, region, and call center on the report. So very similar to the previous one, because the call center is the lowest level of detail here in the hierarchy, geography hierarchy, which is country, region, and call center. This report is considered to be at the call center report level. So the metric, which is revenue here, is calculated at the call center level. That's why we have a row in this report for each call center, and of course, combination of that call center with region and country. Let's take a look at another example. We're now going to look at a report that runs for category, subcategory, and the revenue therein. Here we're showing for each category all the possible subcategories and the revenue per subcategory. So can you guess what is the report level for this? The report level here is subcategory, as you may have guessed. For each subcategory, we have a row on this report that shows the revenue. Let's take one final example to clarify what is meant by report level. And here we look at the same report as we did before, except we have added item to the template. And what we will notice here is that in the books category, in the art and literature category, for each item, we have the revenue, and similarly for other categories and subcategories too. So the report level for this particular report is item, because that is the lowest in the hierarchy for category and subcategory, or the product hierarchy, so to speak. And for each item, we have a revenue shown here. So hopefully you understand what is meant by the report level. It is the lowest level attribute that is on the template in that particular hierarchy. So in the product hierarchy of category, subcategory, and item, if I have item on the report, then that is the lowest level, and that is what is called the report level for this report. Now let's consider a simple report that's shown here. In this report, we have category, subcategory, and revenue, but we are filtering on 4 subcategories, namely business, literature, cameras, and computers. And we're only filtering for the year 2010. So this simple report basically shows you the category for the subcategories that we picked, which is books and electronics. And for each subcategory, it shows the revenue for that item and the total for these 2 categories that we picked in subcategories that we picked. And same here. And then, of course, the total for the entire list of subcategories that we have chosen for the year 2010. The need for level metrics arises because we want to compare the line items shown here, revenue for the business subcategory or the revenue for the literature category, in comparison to various subtotals for the category. So for example, we may want to see what fraction of the books category revenue, namely this $170,710, what fraction of that was due to the sales of business subcategory books, and which fraction was due to literature. In order to understand this better, we need to take a look at exactly what data we have in our database. So here is the base data. Here I'm showing all category, subcategory revenue for year 2010. And I have highlighted the subcategories that are shown in my report, which is filtered for specific category, subcategory, and for the year 2010. So as you can see, there are other subcategories in books, electronics, and other categories and subcategories which are not shown in this report. However, when comparing this revenue, let's take the revenue for business here, we may want to make different comparisons. Let's take a look at what we mean by that. So let me unhide some of the columns here. Okay, so if I want to take the ratio of this revenue to the category revenue, which category revenue am I talking about? Am I talking about this number here, which is only the subtotal based on the 2 categories that I showed in this report? Or is it this number here, which is the sum of revenue for all the subcategories in books, whether they're shown on this report or not? And the same thing for electronics. Yet another way is possible for us to calculate a comparison number, which is this one here, And this number comes from the total for both these categories that were on the report. Another way of computing the reference against which we will compare our revenue for a particular line item is this right here, which is the sum of all the revenue generated for books for the year 2010 and all the revenue for all the subcategories of electronics that was generated for the year 2010. Not just the two subcategories shown for books and the two subcategories shown for electronics on this report. So we could have this number, and we may want to see what fraction of this revenue was generated by the business subcategory in books. And finally, the last way in which we can compute the subtotal is where we take this number here, which is the sum of all the subcategories for the year 2010, regardless of whether they are included on the report or not. So there are many ways of showing this, of calculating these subtotals, and level metrics will help us to compute these different subtotals. In order to calculate these various subtotals for the category, we will be creating different level metrics, and we'll be utilizing different level metrics in our reports to get these numbers. Just to show you an example of how these numbers are used, let me take this very first example here and show how it might be used in a report for comparison. So here is the same report that we had earlier, and I have added to that a column called the category revenue, which is essentially this subtotal here and this subtotal here. And we've got in this last column another metric which shows the ratio of this number to this and this number to this. So this one is 57.5%, this is 42.5%, and so on. So to create the level metrics that will give us these numbers shown here, we need to understand three parameters that define a level metric. The first one of those is the target, which is the attribute level at which the metric calculates. As you can see in all of these examples, the attribute level at which we want to calculate the metric category revenue is category. So for all of these examples going forward, the target for our level metric will be category. The second parameter that defines how the level metric will work is the filtering parameter. It determines how the report filter is used in calculation of the metric. Remember, in this particular report here, our report filter has subcategory and year. The filtering criteria or filtering parameter of level metric defines how this particular filter will or will not be applied when calculating the category revenue level metric. Each of these as defined here. So let's go back to our slide here. Filtering applies only to those report filtering criteria that are related to the level metrics target attribute. Remember, we just said a few minutes ago that our target for all of these level metrics here is going to be the category attribute. Now, in the filter, the only related attribute is subcategory. Year is not related to the category. Therefore, year is unaffected. The year filter part is unaffected. Only the subcategory part will be affected by the filtering criteria. So let's take a look at what are the four filtering criteria that are available to us. The first one is standard. Here the metric calculation applies the report filter as is. In other words, the same subcategory filter is applied in the calculation pass of the SQL that is generated for calculating the category revenue metric. Second is absolute. Here, metric calculation applies the report filter after raising the filter level to target. Let's take a moment to figure out what that means. The report filter has subcategory. The metric calculation applies the report filter after raising the report filter level. So report filter level is subcategory. After raising it to the target level. What is the target? The target is category. So subcategory raised to the category level, which basically gives us these numbers right here. So if we raise the subcategory to the category level in calculation of the metric, not in calculation of the overall report, but in calculation of the metric, which is this revenue category revenue metric right here, this is the number that we will get if we used filtering as absolute, because now it doesn't care what was shown on this report. It says, give me all the revenue subtotaled for every subcategory in the two categories that appeared on my report. Yet another way to calculate the metric is with filtering criteria of ignore. If you say ignore, then metric calculation completely ignores any related report filtering criteria. In this case, since the report filter has subcategory and the metric target has category, which are related, the ignore filtering will ignore this entire subcategory filtering for calculation of the metric. One of the things to note is that when we use grouping of standard, as we will talk about next, shown right here, we'll come back to it in a second. When we use grouping of standard, you get the same result whether you use filtering of absolute or filtering of ignore. So keep that in mind, filtering absolute or filtering ignore with standard grouping will give you the same numbers. The final filtering criteria is none, and it's used with grouping of none to force the use of a particular fact table in metric calculation. As we said, we're not going to discuss that further. The third parameter that is used for level metrics is grouping, and this determines how the metric aggregates. This parameter affects the group by clause of the SQL pass that calculates the metric. There are two values for this that we use in level metrics. One is standard, and that would group by the attribute level specified as the target. So in our case, because we're using category as the target, if we use standard grouping as we have in the blue areas here, the standard grouping will basically group by the category level. If we say none, it excludes the target and related attributes from grouping. As you can see in this yellow area here, there is no grouping based on, there is no grouping, and therefore all the rows in the report have the same number. So if you go down here, for this particular filtering standard, grouping none, you see the same number. Filtering absolute, grouping none, you see the same number. Filtering ignore, grouping none, you see the same number. So now let's go ahead and run some reports to show how we are getting these different numbers here. We're now going to run reports with different category revenue filters, the differences being in the filtering and the grouping criteria that we have specified. So I have already created various metrics using level metric parameters, filtering, and grouping. Let's take a look at one of those in the metric editor, and that's this one right here, the category revenue with filtering standard and grouping standard. As you can see, the formula is the sum of revenue at the category level. This one specifies, this category says at category level. We can see that better over here. We always leave the report level as standard and standard, and then category, in this case, we have chosen filtering standard and grouping standard. There's no special conditions specified and no transformation specified. So with that, we're going to go ahead and run a report. So we'll run a report which utilizes filtering standard and grouping standard. That is my first report here. Let's double click on that. And as you can see, you're seeing in this report the revenue numbers shown here. These revenue numbers will be the same in all the reports. And the category revenue is the one with filtering standard and grouping standard as shown in this column and as labeled over here. So filtering standard and grouping standard is basically doing exactly the same kind of breakdown as on this report, except the totals here are at the category level. So for each row, you now have a category total that is inclusive of only the subcategories shown on this report. The next report that we'll run will be for filtering absolute or ignore. We'll take first the filtering absolute and grouping standard. So let's go to that report. That's report number 2. Here, as you can see, the numbers that you see are these two numbers here, the 650,192 and 602,7843. As you can see, by doing filtering absolute, we have raised the level of the subcategory filter here to that of the target, meaning we have raised it to the category level in computation of the subtotals. And therefore, we are including all the subcategories in each of the two categories shown here, not just these two. So we're including art and architecture, business, literature, books, miscellaneous, science and technology, sports and health in the books category for getting this subcategory, or rather this category revenue. So a third one is we're using filtering of ignore and grouping of standard. And as we mentioned earlier, whether you use absolute or ignore as the filtering, as long as grouping is standard, you're going to get the same result, as you can see here. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the differences, there are differences in the SQL that is generated for the absolute versus the ignore case, even though the end result is the same. And you can see that in Microstrategy Developer in the SQL view. So that takes care of the three situations where grouping is standard. Those are shown here in blue. The next set of level metrics will use grouping of none. And you can see that grouping is none because all the numbers are the same in every single row. So if we use this particular metric, level metric, you'll see that the total it calculates is 1,895,845 for every row, and so on for these over here. So let's take a look at filtering standard and grouping of none. So when filtering is standard and grouping is none, we're getting the subtotal, grand subtotal or grand total of all the subcategories that are on the report. And we'll see that here in this report. That would be report number 4. And there you go, filtering standard, grouping none. You can see the revenue is the same, but this number is the same all the way through. Next, we'll look at filtering absolute and grouping of none. And that is number 5 here. So filtering is absolute, grouping is none. That's the number that we get over here, which is the sum of these two numbers shown here. So let's take a quick look here. If you add this number and this, which is the subtotal for all subcategories, whether they're shown on this report or not, and subtotal for all these subcategories, whether they're shown on this report or not. Those two taken together gives us this number, which is over here. And that is what is shown in this report when you do filtering absolute and grouping of none. So compare that with this over here. Here, when we did filtering of absolute, we got these numbers as shown here. The only difference between that and this one here is that because there is grouping of none, these two numbers get added up and rolled up into a single total. The final one is filtering of ignore and grouping of none. So as we said, when you do a filtering of ignore, it ignores all the filters and essentially just goes all the way down and adds up every single subcategory revenue and gives the grand total here that is repeated across all the rows. And that's what you see here. So that's it for various level metrics. I'm going to move this out of the picture here so you can once again see this slide. And as shown on this slide, you can basically see that when this is the data that you have, let me make this a little bit smaller so you can see the whole thing. Essentially, here are your different breakdowns for filtering standard, grouping standard, filtering absolute or ignore and grouping standard, filtering of standard and grouping of none, filtering absolute, grouping of none, and filtering of ignore and grouping of none. I hope this video has helped you understand level metrics in MicroStrategy. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thanks again.